Signore e signore, buonasera. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight at the Casa to celebrate and discuss two new translations of work by Eugenio Montale, Nobel Prize for Literature, one of the most renowned poets of the Italian 20th century. And to do this, we have the fortune of having with us two scholars and translators of Montale. The books we are presenting are two, but unfortunately the translator of one of the books is not here with us, but we'll manage to go over it a little bit and tell you something also about that book. The first book we're presenting is Butterfly of Dinard by Montale, translated by Oonagh Stransky and Marla Moffa, and we have Marla here with us, with an introduction by Jonathan Galassi, who is also here with us. The other book is Late Montale. It's a selection of poems, of late poems by Montale, translated and selected by George Bradley. Tonight, we have the fortune, as I told you, to have Marla and Jonathan here with us, and I'm going to tell you something briefly to introduce them. Marla was born in Massachusetts. She lives in Italy, in Bologna. She is a playwright and an author of children's book on top of being a translator. An interesting fact that actually moved me was the fact that her father actually wrote a book, Lettura della farfalla di Dinard. He was a professor at Mount Holyoke College here in the States. And basically, Marla grew up with this book around and hearing about this book. So it's fitting enough that she decided to translate it. And her new translation is also a complete translation of the work of Montale. The previous English translation omitted, I believe, 5 stories. So now we have the whole thing. And Jonathan Galassi is the chairman and executive editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. He's much more than that. He's a poet, he's a translator, he is an author of novels. You find all his biography and bibliography that is very extensive. I cannot but praise him for his role in promoting contemporary Italian literature in this country. He really played an absolutely, yes, he deserves an applause. In a non-partisan way, because at the same time he promoted a lot of English language and all other languages stuff. But that's exactly what was needed. I mean, we can have conferences and lectures within places like this for preaching to the choir. Jonathan had the courage of preaching outside of the choir, using the pulpit that he had as a publisher and editor, really to bring Italian poetry into the discourse of the American intellectual and cultural debate. And for this, myself and everybody who has an interest in Italian poetry and Italian literature is very, very grateful to Jonathan. It's always a pleasure to welcome him back to the stage of Casa Italiana. So without further ado, please welcome Marla Moffa and Jonathan Galassi. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start because I'm supposed to be the moderator. But I want to thank Stefano for... Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to first thank Stefano for his kind words. And I want to say how exciting it is to have Marla here. And she gave me, when we were meeting before, her father's book about this book, which I did not have. And so it's very exciting for me to understand this book through her lifelong knowledge of it. And it is a very revealing book about Montale. I'm just going to say a few things before I grill her. But Montale, as Stefano said, is one of the greatest of the 20th century poets, Nobel Prize. And his books, he was born in 1896 in Genoa, and he published 3 major books before this book was published. One is Ossi di Seppia, which is his most famous book about the Cinque Terre, where his family had a house where he spent the summer, and it's about the sea and it's an existential drama about the sea and doubt and selfhood, etc. And it's also, how would you say, a crypto-political book too. because he was coming into his own as a writer when fascism was coming into its own, and that's an important part of the subtext. Then he wrote another book while he was living in Florence called Le Occasioni, which is a kind of Dantesque book. It has a kind of atmosphere of medieval color, and it's centered in one way on a woman he calls Clizia, who was a woman he met there, an American scholar he had a passionate entanglement with that went on for a long time. And then his third book, which was published after the war in I think 1956, was about the war and about the dissolution of his relationship with Clizia and another woman who he called Volpe, who was a different, less spiritual, more earthbound person, at least in the terms of his poetry. By the way, he was living with someone else, his so-called wife, all the time that this happened. So it's a complicated story. But anyway, 1956, he was 60 years old. He published La Bufera, which many people think is the greatest book of the 20th century in Italian poetry. And the same year, he published Farfalla di Dinard, which is, well, why don't you tell us what it is? Why don't you begin by telling us what Farfalla di Dinard is?
Before I answer the question, I just want to say thank you for for coming, and it's really special for me to be here this evening. I want to thank New York Review of Books for publishing this book, and Casa Italiana for hosting this event, because I think it's very special that we can talk about Montale today. Farfalla, as was mentioned, is a book that has been on my father's bookshelf ever since I can remember. I was always curious about this title. Montale has a way of choosing interesting titles also for his poems, often choosing the names of places that aren't so obvious. So I think Dinard also, often when people ask me, when I was working on it, I said, I'm working on Butterfly of Dinard. They said, what? Or, excuse me. So it's a title that is unique. As Jonathan mentioned, I saw this book on my father's bookshelf, and unfortunately it wasn't until he passed away in 2015 that I decided to open the book, which is unfortunately what happens. I mean, in 1986, when my father wrote the critical text, I was only 11. I guess that's excusable that I didn't think about reading his critical text at the time. But so I didn't open it until 2015. When I did open the book, alongside with my father's book, which is a guide to reading it, I was really, the stories aren't immediate stories, if we can call them that. Maybe we'll speak about it. They're sketches, they're pieces. They're pieces that he wrote for Corriere della Sera between 1946 and 1950. So even I like to think of them as occasions. In fact, the second book of poems, which is called Le Occasioni, these are flashes or occasioni to learn something about Montale's personal life. So for me, these pieces give us a way to understand his life, not just through his poetry, but actually what he was living. He said this was his autobiography. If people wanted to know truths about his life, they said, you should read this book. And it's very special in that because we see Montale in a different light. We see him where he's making fun of himself. A lot of the stories are full of irony. We see him walking around with a pillowcase on his slipper and the men in pajamas. So it's a way to discover an author that, not just as the big poet who won the Nobel Prize, but somebody who's very human and lives these silly and trivial things, he said, but that are really very important and meaningful.
Maybe we should just say that after the war, he was hired. He lived in Florence during the war, but afterwards he was hired by Corriere, which is in Milan. So he moved there, and he was hired as a journalist. So he had to write all this. He wasn't used to writing more popularly. So, but he was, but he had to produce all these pieces. And at first, he found it very difficult to switch from being an art writer to being a more popular writer. But he was really good at it, and he wrote sometimes 2 or 3 pieces a week that went on the 3rd page in an Italian newspaper as well, sort of opinion and culture, and these pieces are from the many things he wrote: literary criticism, opera reviews, all sorts of art reviews, and all sorts of stuff. But these were the more personal, as Marla said, that it was kind of autobiographical in a kind of somewhat hidden way, but very revealing. And they come from the same sources as his poetry. They're not based on his poetry, but the substrate is his life. So people do compare them to the poems in many ways, which is, if you're a Montale freak, which I am, it's fascinating. So
yeah, there's many reoccurring symbols. So there's, for example, the butterfly. Actually, the symbol of the butterfly, you'll see, if you read his poetry, you'll find it reoccurring in many of his poems, and then it is also the protagonist of this volume of pieces. The way also less, maybe what can seem less attractive than a butterfly, he often speaks about eels, right? And the eel is a reoccurring symbol in his poetry, but also in this book, because when he grew up in Liguria, eels were found near his house in ditches and things like that. So I remember my father used to read, at Christmas time, he would read poems out loud, and he would often choose something by Montale or Ungaretti. And I remember when he read to me The Eel by Montale, and I just thought, if a poet, he has to be a poet if he can make something so disgusting sound beautiful, so that really stayed with me.
yes, the eel is the sort of life force, and it's actually L'Anguilla, the eel, is probably his most famous poem, and it's an incredible thing. But it does have a very sexual connotation too, and there's a wonderful story in there where he's having dinner with an unnamed someone who was his wife, I think, and on the menu is eel alla livornese and a kind of bird, and the eel and the bird are 2 of his major symbols. And she says, "Oh, you're always fishing around in the eels of your past," or something. She's very ironic about him, and it's one of the best stories, because it's all about the substrate of his poetry and his view of the world, but he makes fun of it in a way.
Yes, it's the story is called The Best Is Yet to Come.
Right.
And he's going back, he lives in the past, so he's thinking about the eels. He's in a fancy restaurant and could order anything he wants on the menu, but actually what he wants is to eat an eel that he ate when he was a child, roasted on a fire in the garden. So he's really living in the past, and that story really exemplifies that. He was very attached to the past. His childhood in Liguria was part of his magma, for sure, what he drew from.
To me, that's the best part of the book. The first part is about his going back to where he grew up and thinking about it, and also telling stories about it, but also revising it and all. So the book, to me, is very much self-critical and it's about how uncomfortable he is in the current world, and so he idealizes his childhood in one way.
Uncomfortable, and I would say also a real sense of isolation. So the role of the artist in the world and his feeling of being sort of an outsider, that really comes across in the last piece, which is the title piece, which is Butterfly of Dinard, where he feels that there's a butterfly and he's the one seeing it, but not everybody else is seeing this butterfly. So the idea really that when you look at the world through a poetic lens, you can look at it, you can see things that other people can't see. And reality isn't always so pleasant, you know, and he tends to, when I finished the translation, I mean, so many things stayed with me, but one thing I like to think is that now I really look at the world as divided in two, like those who see butterflies and those who don't see the butterflies. So I like to think that.
The symbol, the commonplace in Italian poetry goes all the way back really to Dante of the La donna che non si trova, as Leopardi said, the woman who can't be found. And in a way, the butterfly is the symbol of the woman who escapes being captured by the man or being present for the man. And that's certainly one of the main themes of Montale's poetry, as it is Dante, Petrarch, Leopardi. It's the Italian subject in a way. Mm-hmm. And this story sort of symbolizes that in a modern, don't you think?
Yes, for sure. The ephemeral, everything that is sort of that you can't grasp, and that's reoccurring in other pieces actually, because it often occurs that Montale is seeing things that other characters in the stories aren't seeing. For example, in The Ostrich Feather, he sees a feather, and then a cleaning lady comes into the room, and she's not seeing that same feather. She says, maybe it's a pigeon feather, but it's definitely not an ostrich feather, whereas he's convinced it's an ostrich feather. So it's as if the world, like when I would say the imagination comes into contact with the practical, it's as if that imagination is somehow doesn't survive. It's shattered. It can't survive in the mundane, you know. So that's that feeling of isolation, where he does feel that he's a survivor in a world that is going on without him, and he's seeing the butterflies, but not everybody is.
He went through fascism and the war only to be confronted with communism and political strife, and also he was very disappointed by the post-war reality, and maybe that's just his nature is to find reality disappointing in some way, and having an ideal that he's always.
Well, for sure, during fascism, it was a very difficult time as a poet, but also for his contemporaries. Living in Italy in those years, the poets had, you know, their voice couldn't be heard. At least it was censored to a certain degree. So that was very difficult. And he did feel that at the time, because they didn't have that freedom of expression, which is something he cared deeply about, the freedom to express himself. So this idea of being a prisoner, he felt that also just the cultural level after fascism, because during fascism it wasn't developed, it wasn't heightened. After fascism, there was a lot of the level was not heightened. So that in the stories, Dancers at the Diavolo Rosso, he speaks about that as if there's a group of intellectuals that are gathering, but the younger generation is just not up to par, because they're just not exposed to the same things that group had been exposed to.
Plus they want the stage, and
exactly.
people with the past.
Yeah. So it's if he's aware that this
It's a
generation, the generational change is not,
Not welcome.
yes, yeah.
So that's kind of, just to interrupt for 1 minute, the book, Marla's book, is really a backwards look and a kind of disabused look at so many things. And this other book, late Montale, the poems that he wrote after La Bufera, and he wrote a lot, actually, as much or more than his first 3 books, but they're often quite disillusioned, bitter, ironic, and as he gets older and older, he writes more sort of notebook sort of poems that repeat. They revisit some of his themes from before in a kind of elegiac way. So there are 2 Montales. There's the major Montale up to La Bufera, and then there's the later Montale, which many people consider minor, but which is fascinating too. But this book is like a lead into that.
Yeah, I would say it's a lead into it because it's more conversational. And I think that's what happens after he's published this book, because this is published alongside with The Storm, etc., which was his 3rd volume of poetry. But what follows then is Satura. And the poems that you'll find in Satura, but then also in late Montale, it's really, they're just, I feel they're more conversational. They're as if he's yes, more prosaic. So for sure, also more personal, I would say, especially Satura, as if his experiment in writing about himself, which what happens in Butterfly of Dinard, he's really revealing parts of himself. In the poems that follow, he's becoming more personal. I think they're surprising, the poems about his wife who has passed away in Satura. It really shows as if he's coming into contact with something that is new for him. And I think that has influenced his writing, so the writing about himself in this book.
Yeah, I mean, in the other books, there's this mythologizing of these women that he's idealizing, and then in Satura, which was published in 1971, I think, which is the period written in the period after, his wife, who he'd been with but not with, and so on. She dies, and all of a sudden, the grief that he feels for her is very deep, and those poems, the Xenia poems, are among his greatest work, but they're in a totally different tone, as you say, very talky in a way. Yeah. So what I want to know is, how did you? I mean, this is a book you heard about all your life. You were probably tired of hearing about it. What made you decide to confront it?
Well, there's also a special story I'd like to tell. It's about my co-translator who couldn't be here today. Unfortunately, is Oonagh Stransky. There's a nice coincidence. And when my father passed away in 2015, my family received a letter of condolences from Oonagh Stransky, who I had never heard from before. And she wrote in this letter saying that she had been a student of my father's at Middlebury College in the summer of 1986, and that thanks to my father, she took the first course in Italian with my father in 1986. And thanks to that class, she went on to take other Italian classes, to study Italian her junior year abroad, to go on and marry an Italian man, to have children, and then they grew up in Italy. So to decide to be a translator of Italian literature, and she was attributing all of this to my father, to the fact that he gave her the love of the Italian language. So I was really moved by this letter. And when I read the letter, I said, I need to meet this person. And the coincidence was that I was living in Bologna and she was living in Cortona, which is about 2.5 hours away. So we ended up meeting, and when we met, I did give her a copy of my father's book, which she hadn't read. And after she read the book, and she also found it very interesting. We decided we started having the conversation to say, what if we translated this book? I mean, we need a new translation. The last translation is from 1971, and it was feeling outdated. It wasn't complete, and it's just
Wasn't that good either.
it was just such a special book. I can't say that, though.
I can.
Okay. So I just felt it was really our project. It was the project that we wanted to work on together. My father would have been so happy to see this moment, to know that this book, let's say, found a new edition in the English language, because he's Italian, but he taught over 40 years in the United States, Italian, so he's a great, scholar of Montale, but also other contemporary Italian poets. So,
Yeah, it's wonderful. I really wish Oonagh were here to be to share this. Well, you two did an amazing job with it. It's
Thank
a
you.
difficult book to translate.
it's a very difficult book. Yes, also because when Montale wrote these pieces, he didn't write notes. He just assumed that people knew what he was talking about. There's a lot of allusions and things that aren't obvious at all. We had a lot of research to do. So even just when there's a section where he talks about various arias of operas, and he's just throwing down these names or characters, and you just, at the time, people did go to the opera. People knew what these arias were. They knew who these characters were. Today, a lot of people don't know, and so it was interesting also to have these things to go and research.
Well, he studied to be an opera singer before he became a poet, so it was deeply ingrained in his culture, and he was the opera critic for the Corriere d'Informazione. So he had a lot of power as a critic too.
Yeah, he was speaking from personal experience, so it was very, and some of those stories about bel canto are really, I find them hilarious. I mean, the ostrich feather, I highly recommend it. It's just a wonderful read.
What are some of your other favorites?
Well, for sure, it's hard for me to choose, but for sure because the book is divided into 4 sections. So the first part is his childhood, the second part in Florence just before the war, the third part is just after the war, during the war, and after the war, and the last section is his when he was already in Milan. There's also many trips abroad. In the first section, I have to say that some of the most moving stories are, for me, The House with Two Palms, which is when he goes back to visit his house in Monterosso. And there's a moment when he says he's taking the train back there, so he's going back to visit the house. And he remembers that at the time when he would go, when he was in the train, he would see a relative waving a white handkerchief. And that was the signal to say, go and put the pasta on, And so and then the day that he goes back, he says nobody was waving a handkerchief that day, and it's very sad. I mean, it's sad. It just brings you back to when you go visit a place of your past.
I also love the third part, which is about his relationship with Mosca, his wife, and it's very ironic and funny, and it talks about their relationship. There are all these weird animals that they evoke, and she says, our life is a menagerie, and she's very caustic about him. But
yeah, those the story relics, when they're looking through, they keep like a box where they have photographs of animals. So there's Ortello, this horse, and then there's an okapi. Montale was in love with the okapi. He thought it was a beautiful animal. And they talk about these animals that they find. So they either collect photographs or they give them names, personal names, that become special for them. And I think also working on the translation, these images have stayed with me. So when I see now an okapi,
How often do you see one?
Well, I did see one in the newspaper, and I had to photograph it. I sent it to Oonagh, obviously, so we shared that moment. And so what we have now, like a kind of photo album of symbols from this work together. And some of them, even the dahlia, the flower, which is in the first story, the story of a stranger, it's mentioned that his father is in the garden watering the dahlias. And in the last story, Butterfly of Dinard, he says, there's a vase of flowers, but he doesn't say which flowers, but then he says the vase of dahlias. So now for me, the dahlia has become a special flower. When I see a dahlia, it's a Montalian flower. I can't look at it in the same way anymore. And I feel a lot of things have now taken on a deeper meaning. The same with places in Italy or abroad. I haven't been to Dinard yet, but it's on my list of things to do. There was Piazza dei Cavalli in Piacenza, which in the story, The Flight of the Sparrowhawk, he imagines that this sparrowhawk is flying over the Piazza dei Cavalli. And I thought, wow, that sounds so beautiful, this Piazza dei Cavalli. I had to go to Piacenza. I went to Piacenza. I went to see Piazza dei Cavalli to imagine the sparrowhawk flying over the piazza. I photographed it. I sent it to Oonagh. So we've been doing this kind of thing over these years together.
Wow, that's great. One thing I learned recently, I don't know if, is that Mosca, her name was Drusilla Tanzi, and she was actually the aunt of Natalia Ginsburg.
Yeah, that rings a bell. Actually, I had forgotten that.
Yeah, which is, and Montale wrote an incredibly great review of her book, Lessico Familiare, Family Lexicon. Many people think it's the best piece about her. So, but it shows you what a tight circle it was. And actually, during the war, maybe because of Mosca, but also he had many Jewish friends, and he was very tight with the poets and artists and of Trieste and other places.
Yeah, there's the with Trieste. There's the story, the paintings in the cellar that he mentions going to see these paintings that he finds of a futurist and a painter.
Yeah, not such a good one.
Yes.
Right. And of course, he was a painter himself too later on. So. Well, Montale it's a well that if you fall into it, you can't get out of it. Really, I find
it's a good well to fall into.
Yeah. Who else are you working
on? I have to say that this book was so important for me that I needed a pause after this book. I really didn't feel I could just take on another translation project. So I've been working a little bit more on my writing rather than a work in translation.
You said you were involved in drama.
Right, writing plays. What I have to say is that for my own writing, working from, what I find interesting now is working from poetry. So these plays that I've written now are inspired by poems by Borges. And so starting from a poem, seeing how from a poem you can develop that into a new form of writing, that's something I think I've discovered working on Montale. So from how poetry can also take other roads. And I think that's what I'm exploring now, how from poetry I can go into playwriting.
Marla is one of the few people I know who she can translate from Italian into English and vice versa, which is an incredible gift to have. That's true bilingualism.
Yeah, that's I feel more nervous when I'm translating from English into Italian because that's what I've been doing, trying to do recently. Also because I live in Italy and I feel that working in Italy, the more I feel comfortable writing and proposing projects in Italian, I feel it, the more I feel comfortable being there. So it's something I feel I owe to being in that country.
Have you, what's your take on Montale's position in the culture now in Italy?
Well, I would say that people have heard of Montale for sure. I mean, he's still very very prominent. But I have to say it was interesting that when I would tell people that I was working on Butterfly of Dinard, very few people were familiar with this work. So I'm glad that now it has been republished also in Italian in 2021. So a new edition has just come out, which means that people are beginning to read it again. And I think that I'm hoping that it's going to sort of, I think that these stories can actually be a way for even a younger generation maybe to approach the poetry as well.
Yes, I think that's true. Yeah. Well, maybe we should.
Let's hear a story.
Oh yes, Marla's going to read.
Maybe Jonathan, do you want to prepare maybe a poem from the late poets?
I can do that. But let's hear this. The last story, Farfalla di Dinard.
I'm going to read the last one because it's my favorite, but it's also the shortest. It's considered, I would say, a prose poem, and Cesare Segre wrote in his critical text that it could have been a poem that was part of the third volume of Poetry in the Storm because it could have fit in perfectly well. That tiny saffron-colored butterfly, the one that visited me every day at the cafe, bringing me, or so I thought, your news. Would it return to that cold and windy square in Dinard after I left? It was unlikely that the chilly summers in shivering orchards of Brittany could generate so many sparks, much less all of the same size and color. Perhaps I had encountered not the butterflies, but the butterfly of Dinard, raising the question of whether my morning visitor came just for me, deliberately ignoring all the other cafes in order to see me at mine, Le Cordaille, or if my little corner was merely on its daily flight path. In other words, usual morning stroll or secret message. To dispel all doubts, the day before my departure, I decided to give the waitress a generous gratuity, along with my address in Italy. She was to write me one way or the other, if the winged visitor returned after my departure, or it was never seen again. I waited for the small butterfly to land on a vase of flowers, then pulled out a 100-franc note, a piece of paper and a pencil, and I called the girl over. Stammering in a clumsier than usual French, I explained the situation, not all, but part of it. I was an amateur entomologist and wanted to know if the butterfly would be back, how long it could tolerate the cold. I then fell silent, perspiring with anxiety. Un papillon jaune, asked the graceful filly, staring at me with big eyes à la Greuze. On that vase, I don't see anything. Have another look. Merci bien, monsieur. She pocketed the money and strode off, a café filtre on her tray. I lowered my head, and when I looked up again at the vase of dahlias, the butterfly was gone.
It's such a moving thing about doubt, his own doubt. So I'm going to try to find a poem that sort of relates to that. I'll read one of the Xenia poems, I think, which is about Mosca. This is the last one, I think, and it's about the flood in Florence, which happened in I think 1966, was it? 66. Yeah, So this is it's about what happened to his things that were in the basement of a house there. The flood swamped the clutter of furniture, of documents, of pictures crammed into a basement room closed with a double lock. Maybe they fought blindly, the leather-bound volumes, the endless dedications of Dubois, a wax seal stamped with Ezra's bearded profile, Alain's commentaries on Valérie, a first edition of the Canti Orfici, plus a few brushes for shaving, 1,000 knickknacks, and all the musical compositions of your brother Silvio. 10 or 12 days under that terrible pressure of fuel, oil, and filth. Surely they suffered a lot while they were losing themselves. I too am fighting, and in up to my neck, although my civilian status was dubious from the start. It isn't dirt that's besieged me, but events of a reality so incredible I could never believe it. The courage I faced them with was your greatest gift to me, and maybe you never knew. So those are the two sides of Montale. So anyway, anybody have comments or questions?
Jonathan, I have a question for you and Montale in America. Since you contributed in not a small way, what is your assessment? Does he have a role in? The question is about Montale in America, and of course, Marla, if you have any input too, because you grew up with Montale in America. But both your point of view is, to me, is very fascinating and interesting.
Well, I would say that Montale is probably one of the most influential European poets, and partly because of Robert Lowell, because Lowell translated or did versions of a lot of more of Montale's poems than almost anyone in his book Imitations, which was his look at European poetry, and that had, I think that's what opened up interest in Montale, and there have been a lot of translations of Montale's poetry, going back to people that you wouldn't even know, like Maurice English is one of the first translators, and Singh, who did the first translation of this book, and many other people, including me and William Arrowsmith, and so there's been a lot of, he's been very influential, I think. I wouldn't say he's a popular poet, but very few poets are. But I would say that he's part of the he has been, anyway, part of the conversation. And I think that will happen with a new generation also. It's happening in Italy.
Yeah, there's also a wonderful edition, Glauco Cambon, since we talked about him before. He made a selection of poems, and there were various translators that worked on this selected poems. And one of the translators was also Irma Brandeis, who's one of the women in Montale's.
She was Clizia.
Exactly. So that's interesting that in the United States, I mean, in that group of translators who, they were mostly poets who wanted to translate Montale. So there's been a lot of interest around Montale for sure. That dates back some time now, but I think there's a renewed interest.
I think in the earlier phase, Montale was considered a hermetic poet. In other words, very difficult to understand. So, but I don't think that's true anymore, because everything that was hermetic or undiscussed has been discussed now. So his story is open, and his way of telling it is part of the art of it. And so I think he's much more available than he was. At first, it was a mystery. What is he talking about? Who are these people? What does it mean? Now it's an open book, and I think it's been to his advantage as a writer.
I want to just add that I think Jonathan contributed to making this clarity for the English language, because I have read his translations of the poems, and there are times when in the Italian, with everything that I'm bilingual, and there are words, there's vocabulary that's very complex, and reading it in English sometimes gave me insight that that then going back to the Italian really made things much clearer. So you did a tremendous job with those poems.
I mean, he loved to use difficult words. That was part of his mixture. He would use slang. He would use Latin. He wanted to be difficult.
Right, but with the English, there's a way of making it, I don't want to say simpler, but just comprehensible, you know.
Well,
I cannot resist the temptation, you allow me. We have in the audience Luigi Ballerini, that is one of the foremost experts on Italian contemporary poetry, and not only, and asking from his point of view.
I have a very silly question to ask you.
Please do.
I only wanted to know who the
Wait.
Father Dinard.
The question is?
No, the question is that there is a mention of, I think it's Dov'era il tennis, and somehow where the tennis courts were have turned into a wasteland, and the blame is on Latino-Americani or some South Americans. Do you by any chance found out who they were? Is there a footnote to that?
Well, that's a poem in the Storm, I believe, and there is a story in Farfalla which is called "The Yellow Roses." It talks about Donna Juanita. So it was, if I understood correctly, in Monterosso, so in Liguria, there were many villas that were had been built by these rich people who had come from South America.
and came back to Italy.
Exactly, and so he referred to these sort of very gaudy villas, all with like horrible ornaments and things like that. But who they were specifically, the characters, there's no notes on that, but just the kind
I
of...
was just curious. Okay.
Yeah.
He called them the arricchiti,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. People who had become rich and brought their bad taste back.
Mhm.
Yes, of course. No, come on, don't provoke me. Just well, I don't know.
Well, Montale's not your favorite poet, is
I'm
he?
afraid he's not. But that's okay. But I'm still curious, especially when he writes about eels. And this is funny, actually. He makes the eel originate from the Baltic Sea. Eels actually come from the Sargasso Sea. And, it's one of the many errors that poets indulge with. Carducci makes the sun set from where he raises, and so on. I mean, and poets are famous for getting it wrong. But the poet is actually quite interesting because of the mistake. And I think because of the geographical mistake. It doesn't really matter from a geographical point of view, but I think it is intriguing that he would choose such a northern and cold locality for the origin of what is ultimately a sexual object. Something that I'm not quite sure features positively in the poem. Eels are sort of emblems of something viscous, something that you cannot really grasp because they slip through their fingers and through your fingers, etc. So I think there is a nice contrast there. And also I'd like to bring the fact that another big major poet wrote about eels, Ted Hughes, a very beautiful poem about eels. So maybe eels have a future in poetry. Okay.
Well, I just wonder, when you talk about the coldness of the source of the eels, and then at the end of the poem, he calls them sorella, sister. So maybe that has a certain sexual connotation.
I think you're very true, very true. Yes, thank you.
Thank you both for sharing your work. I'm always very happy when we have translators, and I also would like to thank, Stefan and Casa, of course, for hosting so many occasions where we can talk to translators, because I think, as Marla was pointing out earlier, the work which you do is not only interesting because you're bringing a text to a different linguistic context, but it's really important in terms of making things more understandable in many cases. And of course, Montale, especially Montale the poet, is someone who does require this kind of sort of further layer of interpretation. So, it's not just about it's not just about translation, which is per se something complicated, but it's really about explaining things in a way. And so this is just kind of a broader sense of gratitude, which I have both for translators and for, Casa, which allows us to do these kind of things. And then I have a question really for both of you, which might sort of sound possibly kind of a very basic one, but in the case of Montale, I think it's pretty also important one. Of course, as we were saying, Montale is mostly known by the people who know about him as a poet, right? But the sheer amount of prose which he wrote is substantial. If you think about the Meridiani Mondadori with the collection of the essays he would publish on the Corriere, it's a huge amount of work. So I'm curious, since we're talking about Farfalla, which is of course a collection of prose pieces, even if they have elements of poetry within them, as you were saying earlier, I'm wondering to what extent you find that there's this unavoidable temptation of looking for Montale the poet when you read Montale the prose writer, or do you manage to sort of detach one from the other? Because in fact, when we work with both of them, some substantial differences are there, and yet of course we tend to have Montale the poet right in our ears. So I'm wondering whether this is something relevant to the work which you have done, or how do you sort of deal with this particular tension?
No, you're the.
What's coming to mind is that in these days that I've been back here, I went to visit in Amherst the Emily Dickinson home that was recently renovated, and during the guided visit, we read the poem "I Dwell in Possibility," the poem that's about poetry versus prose. And she says, "I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, so more the windows." So this idea that in poetry there are more windows than prose, I was thinking about this because I was wondering how that could relate with this work. And let's imagine that if poetry has more windows, which is a nice metaphor, I like to think that Montale set up with the first 3 volumes of poems these windows. So we have a lot of windows. But through this book of prose, we get to choose one of those windows, so one of those landscapes, and it's as if we go to a fork in the road and we're choosing one of the roads and we get to go down it and see the story that unfolds there. So we're seeing Montale young in Liguria in one of these, in the House of Two Palms, and how he lived in that house and what's happening. We don't just see the bluffs or the cliffs. We really get to know the story. That I think is for me what I would say how I'm thinking about these two things in parallel right now.
I would just add that, at one point in my introduction, I call him a garrulous writer because, he became a really, really expert prose writer, and his prose is wonderful, I think. It's very, very fluid, and so. But he started out much tighter. When he started trying to write these prose pieces, it was difficult for him. He couldn't relax, but he did relax, and he became, I think, a fabulous prose writer. I don't know if you agree, but I did. But he also said, "I've written one poem," and at the end of his life, he said, all his poems became one thing, and lots of poets say that, like Wallace Stevens and so. That's an interesting thing to think about, how his style evolved over time. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd like to make an observation. I have read some of the columns that Montale has written for the Terza Pagina, and I don't think he meant them to be poetic in any way. They were prose.
Right.
Now, the question that I have, has Montale translated any foreign poets into Italian?
Yes, Emily Dickinson, Shakespeare. There's a whole quaderno di traduzioni a whole book of his translations. Some are better than others, right?
Which are the better ones?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, for instance, I would just say his translations of the metaphysical poets, Shakespeare, they were very influential on some of the poems in La Bufera, you know, where he sort of adopted the kind of rich, complex metaphors. And
Yeah, there's also Montale's Hamlet, which is sort of been very, very appreciated in
I
Italian.
haven't read that, yeah. Of course, then there are other things that he took credit for translating, but actually some of his lady friends translated, right? Which is an Italian, people do that, right? Or they did it, right?
They name a few Americans who do that?
I don't know. But he did put his name on some books that he didn't really do. So.
Thank you both. Could you both talk a little bit about your process of translating, and then what are some of the challenges that you found in particular working with this text?
For me, again, a metaphor that comes to mind is just when I was working, is that of the archaeologist. I felt I really had to dig, so I wanted to make sure I got the meaning of every word. And that meant going down deep sometimes because, again, some of the things that Montale speaks about weren't obvious at all. So I wanted to make sure that the meaning was clear, so there's a way of kind of layering. So once I was sure that that meaning, the meaning of the word, then it was what would be the best word in English to convey that. The process, it might be curious for you just with Oonagh working in two, because it's not, I think the fact that they were short pieces was helpful rather than a novel to work in two, and a novel would have a different kind of breath to it. So we worked actually on all the stories together in the sense that I worked on the first layer, what I call the first layer, so really digging and finding the meaning to every word, and then I would, it's actually interesting, when we decided to work on the project together, to kind of do a test, we did it on the last story, so Butterfly of Dinard, and we both did a sample, and we sent it to each other, but in the exact same moment, making sure that we wouldn't look, beforehand. So we said, if you're ready, let's send it to each other. And when we read each other's versions, mine was closer to the text, and Oonagh, who's a more experienced translator than myself, had taken more liberties. It was a little bit more, what I would say, flow. So we then decided that really what would make the best was really a middle way between these two versions. So that's what we kept as our way forward, a sort of middle way between something that was very faithful to the text, but at the same time had found a new idiomatic ease really in the English language. That was fundamental. I had to really flow. So basically I was working on the first layer, then she came in and added sort of this breath to it, and then I worked on her third layer, which was rereading, and then we went back and forth on the telephone quite a lot. And
in a way, that almost makes it sound easier in the sense that you had somebody else breaking open what you were doing, which is hard with the translation. You also had a great editor, Susan Barber.
Yes, I want to thank Susan Barber, even if she couldn't be here this evening, but we had a wonderful editor. She was so passionate about this work. She understood the importance of publishing this work, which I think is phenomenal, and she gave us excellent notes. So we worked about, Oonagh and I, on each piece about 10 layers of back and forth, and then we sent it to Susan, and she came back with us with a few notes that then we, again, so I would say each piece went through at least 11 or 12 layers of back and forth editing. So it was a lot of work, but with Susan we had a wonderful relationship. Very grateful.
Yeah, I think she's great.
Yeah. But you didn't answer the question.
Oh, well, when I haven't really translated prose, so, but when I'm trying to do poetry, I try to hear the rhythm, translate the rhythm of the poem into an English rhythm that is natural in some way. So it's not, of course the words have to be right too, but the sound of how it goes from one line to another, that's the underlying challenge, I think, for me anyway. Somebody, I think it was Brodsky, talked about rhythmical equivalence, not exactly the same, but something that works in the other language. So, but it's hard. You just have to go. She said 12 versions. I believe that, just over and over and over until it gels somehow, if it does. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for this. I appreciated it. Paul Ricoeur used to speak about translation and to connect it with the idea of il lutto, of mourning, because as soon as you accept that you lose something in translation, it becomes more acceptable to you. So I am myself a translator, and I learned slowly how to accept the sacrifice, you know? You have to sacrifice something. So I wanted to ask you if that happened a lot in this book, and if you can speak a little bit about the things that you have to let go, which are painful, but which are needed in translation. Thank you.
Well, there were several words in dialect. So, for example, in the first section, there were words in Ligurian dialect, and those, a lot of them got lost in translation. When we could, we did keep something in, maybe giving then an example or translating it in parentheses in English if it was something that we really felt had to be there. There were also words of specialties like gourmet specialties, things from Liguria that, you know, they would eat, and it was important to keep those words in Italian. So we did do that. He did use a lot of also foreign words, so like things in French or things in English, and happily that stayed in those. We kept those in the foreign language, and that we felt worked well to do that. So the choice of for example, in the second section where instead he's in Florence, he's using a Tuscan dialect, and for a lot of words, some things that weren't always obvious for the meanings, and some of those words we did lose, but we tried to find alternatives or to find solutions that might have also been equally, let's say, I'd like to say I don't feel it's I don't feel there was a mourning in this. I mean, I feel that I just think it was really, I was always just thinking what was the best way forward, you know, and just finding solutions that could be constructive and could be joyful, I would say, somehow.
Well, I think that to my own response to what you're saying, which I agree with, is that again, how do you get across the tone of this person who is, you know, so different from what we are, who has so much baggage, you know, who's writing through all his feelings about, and so how do you convey that? And a lot of that you can't convey. That's what you're saying, right? And I think that, you know, I mean, translation is always disappointing in that way, but it's also wonderful. I mean, here we have this book that is for people to ponder and enjoy and learn about Montale and things that they couldn't have done without it. So,
It's absolutely true. It's
so
the art of the impossible.
Right,
to make
right.
It possible. You know, it's the continuous challenge.
all arts are art of the impossible, right? Well, thank you very much for
I
coming.
think we couldn't have a better conclusion than what Sarah just said. And thank you all very much for being here.